Hello and welcome back to Science of Medicine. I'd like to continue our discussion of the brain, this time talking about some of the supporting structures for the brain. One of the things that you have to understand in understanding the central nervous system is that the brain and the spinal cord on the outermost sections are covered by a series of membranes which are collectively called the meninges. These meninges help protect those neuronal cell bodies, and they're made up of different layers. There is a dural layer, a pia layer, and an arachnoid layer. And collectively, these are very important for allowing things to selectively either pass through or not pass through into the central nervous system. And sometimes there are infectious or non-infectious causes that cause these meninges to become inflamed. We call that meningitis. Now, the brain and the spinal cord are also bathed in a fluid, somewhat as a buffered fluid, to basically allow our neurons to be protected in cerebral spinal fluid. It's about 300 milliliters in an adult cerebral spinal fluid amount, and this is moved around throughout the brain and spinal cord through a series of things which are called ventricles, as well as canals in the spinal canal. And if you look in the brain, there are two very large lateral ventricles, these large blue structures here, and then smaller areas, the third and fourth ventricle, that are further down in the structure towards the brainstem. And as I mentioned, this allows for cushioning, if you will, within the brain. Now, it also extends throughout the brain, but not in its formal structure. I want to point a couple things out here. First off, the brain fluid, the cerebral spinal fluid, is made at a certain rate, and it's also drained at a certain rate. Most of the time, those rates are equal, but sometimes you can actually have an increase in the amount of fluid, and that can actually cause an increase in the pressure inside your brain. That becomes problematic, especially since that can actually compress other structures, such as blood vessels. And if you can't transport blood to the brain, it dies, and then you actually die yourself. Now, one of the most important things that you're transporting to and from the brain is your blood supply. And in fact, your brain is bringing nutrients and taking away waste via this blood system very, very frequently. It is very important to understand that without blood, your brain and spinal cord will die, and you will also cease to exist if large portions of your brain die, or critical portions of your brain die. Because of this, there is a redundancy in the transport of blood to your brain. There are large blood vessels in the front or anterior portion that supply blood to the brain, and then also on the back side, on the posterior side. We call these anterior and posterior circulation. Now, these come off of the aorta, which you can see here in this angiogram. On the front side, they form the carotid arteries. The common carotid then comes off on both the left and the right side, and you can feel your carotid pulsing, your carotid arteries pulsing as your left ventricle is squeezing blood out. These common carotid arteries split off into an internal and external branches. It's the internal carotid artery that is actually going and supplying blood to your brain. The internal carotid arteries become the middle cerebral artery. So on the left or the right, either the right or the left middle cerebral arteries. But they have branches. They have a branch before that becomes an anterior cerebral artery, and another branch that eventually becomes what's called the posterior cerebral arteries. There's a small communicating artery that branches off of that to make it into the posterior cerebral arteries. And there is also a connection between this anterior and what will be the posterior circulation, which is called the circle of Willis. Now on the posterior side, you have arteries that come up from the back through what are called the vertebral arteries. They then become a common basilar artery, which then bifurcates into the posterior cerebral arteries. So again, this is a secondary redundant system, but if you lose blood supply for either anterior or posterior on the left or the right, you can have low or reduced blood flow or no blood flow, and that can lead to what we call a stroke, which can lead to death of the cell bodies. I want to talk in detail about the blood supply. So if I look at the anterior circulation and I look at a side view here, you can see the common carotid artery coming off and forming the external and the internal carotid artery, and then the internal carotid artery making that large portion, which is the middle cerebral artery. If I look at this from underneath, so I'm actually coming up through this, you can see the large blood vessels up front, which are the middle cerebral arteries, the two larger vessels that are in the very front, at the very top of this diagram, which are the anterior cerebral arteries, and a little communicating artery between them, as well as on the back, more inferior or down, which are called the posterior cerebral arteries. And there are connections between those which form what's called the circle of Willis. And this allows for the anterior and posterior circulations to actually communicate with each other. You see the two vertebral arteries at the bottom of this, which are coming together to form the common basilar artery. And in fact, you see branches off this that will supply the cerebellum. Here is a wonderful picture, actually, of a brain that is dissected out very nicely to show you this. You see up at the top of this the anterior cerebral arteries that are coming off, that are going to the front of the brain, the middle cerebral arteries that are coming and supplying a lot of the lateral surfaces of the brain, the posterior cerebral arteries, and then they are bifurcated. They have been bifurcations off of this basilar artery. And then you can also see very nicely the superior and inferior cerebellar arteries, which are actually providing blood to your cerebellum. Now, the reason that I brought this up is because it's very important that you understand that a very common condition that exists in humans is when blood flow is stopped or interrupted to the brain, and that can lead to cell death, especially if it is for more than just a very short period of time. And we call this a stroke, which I'll mention here in a few minutes. Now, if you cut off blood, either by bursting a blood vessel or by having a clot to occlude further blood flow, these strokes will affect various functions, and what is affected depends upon where it is. Now, on the anterior cerebral artery, I'm supplying the blue area, the light blue area, which is most of the cortex on the anterior medial surface, like this, and it goes back into the parietal lobes, as well as going down into the basal ganglia on the front portion of it. I have the middle cerebral artery, which is much of the cortical structure on my sides, the pinkish red that I have here on this, that is involved with things like your speech and your motor and sensory, your face, your arms, and the attention. If you remember, we talked on the last video about the homunculus, which showed the different areas. This is different than the anterior cerebral artery, where you had just on the motor and sensory cortex the legs, because that was the middle strip, as well as the executive functioning, which is up front. And then the posterior cerebral artery supplying blood to the posterior portion, the occipital region, also to the thalamus. And so it affects things such as vision, and then if in as much as it affects the thalamus, the deep branches can affect the motor and sensory portions of those axons that are actually in the thalamus. Now the basilar artery is supplying branches for blood to the cerebellum and to the brainstem. And this is a little bit more straightforward because it's a simple way of actually doing this. Sometimes you'll have very, very tiny occlusion or bleeds into the brainstem that can cause a stroke and therefore deficits or some sort of physiologic manifestation of that dead tissue. So as I've mentioned a couple times, stroke in the United States is one of the leading causes of death. 2019, it's about 150,000 people a year. It comes in two types. An ischemic stroke is when I have an occlusion that leads to no blood flow to a region that's further down from the blockage. It's by far the most common, and there are many risk factors for this. This could be things like high blood pressure, smoking that leads to inflammatory changes within the blood vessels, things like atrial fibrillation, which can predispose you to having clots form in your heart, and those can break off and go to places in your brain, as well as hemorrhagic strokes, which is about 15%, and that is due to a rupture of a blood vessel. While people normally think about this in terms of things like an aneurysm, by far, many of your hemorrhagic strokes are from very high blood pressures and a blood vessel bursting. Both of these can lead to death of the neurons, and when that happens, it leads to death of those neurons and no functioning for those neurons that actually have died, and this leads to a deficit. So for example, if on the cortex you were to kill some of the cells that were on the motor cortex of the brain, that could lead to problems with moving a leg. And we'll talk more about the details of this as we get through the neurology section, and I'll do some work some problems on this. So I hope that this has given you an overview of the brain, its functioning, some of the support structures. In the next video, we'll talk about the spinal cord. As always, if you enjoy these videos, you're welcome to subscribe so that you know when new videos come available, or leave comments or likes. I'll see you soon in Science of Medicine.